Hello, YouTube family. This is Jason Youngblood, the author of The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. I wrote that book in 2024, and this is the video version of that book. And in this YouTube channel, we go through the article. It's a critical article on the life and works of Napoleon Hill called The Untold Story of Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time. And there's a lot of YouTube channel videos and then also blogs that are the content of modern day critics who say that Napoleon Hill was a fraud, and they deter you away from believing anything he had to say in Think and Grow Rich. And my goal and my purpose in writing the book and starting this channel is to actually validate Hill's claims as an expert in the field of success, and to show evidence and connections that he actually knew the titans, the wealthy titans that he said he knew, including Andrew Carnegie, Henry Ford, Thomas Edison, Franklin Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, because the article and then the corresponding and subsequent videos or blogs that use that same content and copy it to discredit him actually state that there's no evidence whatsoever, and that is their claim. And so I found in my extensive research several pieces of not only connections and evidences, but also strong indications that he did know these people and that his stories actually validate him as credible, so that people can get the information and know that it comes from a valid source. Any information that you get that you want to apply to your life, if it's from a source that is incredible or not credible at all, or if it's from a source that is not validated, it makes that information not as powerful and not as relevant to your life. And so that's my goal, is for not only people to be able to read, think, and grow rich and apply the principles because it helped my life so tremendously, is for them to know that the other works of Napoleon Hill are actually sound as well. So, in episode 3, we talked about Franklin Roosevelt, the president of the United States from 1933 into the 1940s. I believe it was 1941, and also his connection to President Woodrow Wilson. So, I just wanted to continue that, touch on his relationship with President Roosevelt for a bit, and then talk about Novak's next claim, which is that Napoleon Hill didn't start to claim that he knew Andrew Carnegie until Andrew Carnegie passed away in 1919, which we will find was not true either. So we'll talk about his connection with Andrew Carnegie as well. So if I can share my screen with you in the section of the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. I'll just read this section of the book on his connection with President Franklin Roosevelt, and then we'll talk a little bit about Andrew Carnegie as well. So, despite Hill's efforts to make his philosophy more marketable by changing the title and shortening its contents, The Magic Ladder to Success was a commercial failure. So, this is a national released book that Hill released in 1930, prior to the Law of Success. Or after the Law of Success in 1928, and before his book Think and Grow Rich in 1937. But he had also released the same title with different contents. It was the same exact title, The Magic Ladder to Success, in 1920. It wasn't a full book. It was more like a booklet. It was very thin. And that was his first official release of his philosophy of individual achievement, or his philosophy of success. It was called The Magic Ladder to Success. Now, that wasn't his first book, or The Law of Success in 1928 wasn't his first book. He had actually released 3 booklets in the early 1910s, teens. So his very first book was in 1913. So you'd be interested to know that the name of his first book was 10 Years Promotion in One. So the title of that book that was released in 1913, Napoleon Hill's very first book, was called 10 Years Promotion in One. And he released that through the LaSalle University, because he worked for them as an advertising manager, and he released that book. And then also in 1916, he released the book From Poverty to $10,000 a Year. And then the following year, in 1917, he released a book called How to Sell Your Services. And in that book, we talked about a little bit in his connection with Woodrow Wilson. There are endorsements that are listed on the front page of the book, or in the opening flap of the book, from Andrew Carnegie, John D. Rockefeller, the vice president for Woodrow Wilson, which was Thomas Marshall, and others. And so he had some significant connections with Woodrow Wilson. And so just touching on that this book, The Magic Ladder of Success, was initially released in 1920, and then he re-released it with different content in 1930. So then in 1931, he was forced to give up his New York property and move back to Washington, D.C. After the initial success of the Law of Success in 1928, the royalties began to pour in, and he purchased an estate that was several hundred acres, or a large estate in Saugerties, New York. So it was in upstate New York or in the Catskills area of New York. And so once the stock market crash of 1929 happened, and he began to lose some of his royalties, he actually was forced to give up his New York property. And so he moved back to Washington, D.C., because he had moved there in 1908. So we'll talk a little bit about where he was in 1908. 1908 is a key year, is because it's the year that he says that he first interviewed Andrew Carnegie. But before he moved to Washington, D.C. in 1908, which is where he was living when he interviewed Andrew Carnegie, he lived in Mobile, Alabama, and was the sales manager, and also moving on to be a co-owner of a lumber company. So he was first a sales manager for a gentleman, and then him and that gentleman went into business together and formed a lumber company. He lived in Mobile, Alabama, and then he moved to Washington, D.C. in 1908, and he stayed there until 1912. So he was there for 4 years. So that's why I say he moved back to Washington, D.C. Excuse me, my allergies are messing up. So I'm just going to continue to read on. Once Hill relocated to Washington, he reinvented himself and opened another school called the International Success University. Hill's new school trained students to teach businesses his 17 principles of success, as well as his 30 major causes of failure. He then placed a man named William C. Grace as the school's director and began promoting his classes. One such promotional meeting was hosted by Daniel C. Roper. Roper had previously been the Commissioner of Internal Revenue under President Woodrow Wilson in 1917, another connection to Woodrow Wilson, which is where he met Woodrow Wilson, or which is where he met Daniel C. Roper, was as a member of the Wilson administration and an advisor to the Wilson administration. So here it is, evidence that the Internal Revenue Commissioner under the Wilson administration is now, excuse me, hosting a meeting promoting Hill's school, the International Success University. So after Roper came across the law of success, he sought out Hill to express how perfectly it described the principles of achievement. When Roper introduced Hill at the meeting, he said, I want you to meet a man who has done more to make this a better world than any man engaged in this field of work. Excuse me. Over the next year, Hill would also associate himself with Reuben Upton Darby. On pages 21 to 28 of Think and Grow Rich, Hill relays the story of how Darby and his uncle had traveled to Colorado from Maryland to drill for gold. So this is one of the famous stories in the book Think and Grow Rich, if you've read it, to where Reuben Darby, when he was a young man, him and his uncle went out to Colorado to drill for gold. However, because they never found gold, they sold their drilling equipment and moved back to Maryland. And the man that they sold their drilling equipment to actually struck gold just a few weeks later using that same equipment, and it was just 3 feet away from where they were drilling. They just gave up too soon. So that's a lesson in persistence that Hill talks about and tells this story. After failing to locate the vein of a gold ore, they aborted the mission, sold their equipment to a junk man, and moved back to Maryland. The junk man who bought the equipment then hired a mining engineer to calculate where the vein of gold could be located. He would find the gold just 3 feet away from where Darby and his uncle had stopped drilling. Excuse me. Sorry, I know this is a video I'm going to post on my YouTube channel, but my allergies are acting up. I'm just going to roll with the flow. It doesn't have to be perfect in my opinion, so I'm just going to keep reading here, but excuse my throat clearing. Hill goes on to tell how years later, Darby witnessed a young girl demand 50 cents from his uncle. Despite Darby's uncle being white and the young girl being black during a time when open racism was tolerated, she didn't cower when he gave her a threatening look. Instead, the child would passionately demand the money again. Surprisingly, Darby's uncle relented to the child's obstinance and gave her the 50 cents. Hill uses Darby's experience of giving up on drilling for gold and witnessing the young girl's courage to illustrate his success principle of persistence. Darby went on to become a life insurance agent and sold over $1 million of coverage per year. He attributed his success to these experiences, teaching him not to give up when a customer initially declined his services. Pardon me. And so here's his connection to Franklin Roosevelt, as we read here. So in February of 1933, Darby sponsored a series of Hill's lectures based on his new book, Mental Dynamite, another Hill book that he wanted to release. So he had been wanting to release this since the 30s. It finally came out in 1941, roundabout, and then the sales just weren't taking off. He didn't have very many sales, so there's not very many copies of this book available at all. But there are a few books that are available in rotation that cost a pretty penny to actually gain access to. Hill had spent $5,000 or $120,836 in 2024 to advertise the lectures. However, on March 6th of 1933, President Franklin Roosevelt declared a bank holiday, ordering the suspension of all bank transactions in order to stabilize the banking system. This was in response to panic beginning to spread as people hurriedly withdrew money before their banks closed. States across the country also enacted their own bank holidays to counter massive bank withdrawals. So, in response to the closing of financial institutions nationwide, Hill suspended his advertising campaign. In June of 1923, Hill had delivered the commencement speech to the graduating class of Salem College. This was in Salem, West Virginia. A student named Jennings Randolph was also in attendance that day. Randolph was inspired by Hill's words and went on to attribute his success in life to the speech. As a disciple of Napoleon Hill, Randolph later became close friends with President Franklin Roosevelt. He had worked closely with the president as a congressman during the Roosevelt administration. The president would also appoint Hill's friend Daniel C. Roper as his Secretary of Commerce. On top of knowing three of the president's associates in Grace, William C. Grace, Jennings Randolph, and Daniel C. Roper, Hill himself had known Roosevelt from when he worked for Woodrow Wilson. During that time, President Wilson appointed Roosevelt to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, while he assigned Hill to serve on the Illinois Council of Defense. Soon after Roosevelt took office, Hill would receive an important phone call because of his affiliation with him. The voice on the other end said, "This is Margaret Lehan at the White House. The president wants to see you right away." When Hill arrived at the White House, the president asked him to address the fear that was spreading throughout the country due to the Great Depression and the bank holiday and all the banks closing. So people were panicking. He asked Hill to assist in what he could do because he had written or recently written The Law of Success. Hill agreed and was assigned to join his friend William C. Grace on the board of Roosevelt's National Recovery Administration. So this is the department that Napoleon Hill was in for the Roosevelt administration. It was the National Recovery Administration. And I will show you an article or two of evidence of that from that time period, which is 1934 and 1935. So he actually worked for the National Recovery Administration. And we know that that is true because William C. Grace was on the board of that department. And he was also the director of Hill's College International Success University. When Roosevelt asked him what salary he should receive for his work, Hill replied, "If you wish, put me on the payroll for $1 a year." It was an unofficial role. It was not an official role. While speaking about his services to President Roosevelt, Hill stated that his working for $1 a year illustrated going the extra mile, one of his success principles, as one of the key principles of his philosophy. And so Hill talks about how he began to put out marketing materials and promotional materials to try to actually get people to gain courage and confidence during the Great Depression, instead of taking on the spirit of fear that was spreading throughout the country that people would lose their money. So going on here, during his time serving President Roosevelt, Hill kept his typewriter in the White House because he actually lived in the White House during this time. He kept his typewriter in his room, and during that time, Hill wrote 6 books while staying in the executive mansion, one of which was Think and Grow Rich. He wrote Think and Grow Rich while staying in the White House while he was an advisor to the Franklin Roosevelt administration. He would also include a letter from Jennings Randolph in the introduction to the book. This is why we know that he was actually connected to Roosevelt when he wrote Think and Grow Rich, is because that's what prompted him to include the letter from Jennings Randolph, who was a congressman during the Roosevelt administration and was good friends with President Roosevelt. In the letter, Randolph suggested that Hill write a book about his association with men who made America the richest nation on earth. After Hill wrote the book, okay, the initial title of the book, by the way, was called 13 Steps to Riches, which is the subtitle of the book now. It was not called Think and Grow Rich until 1936, but in 1933, when he initially wrote the book, it was just called The 13 Steps to Riches. After Hill wrote this book, he shelved the project with no timetable for release. Little did he know that in 3 years, he would have two life-changing experiences that would finally make his written philosophy a reality. So in the book, you learn about those two life-changing experiences that would make his 29-year journey from when Andrew Carnegie first asked him to take on the task of writing a philosophy of success to actually releasing it in 1937, what those two life-changing events are. Now, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and show you the section of the Novak article that states that he did not know Andrew Carnegie, or began saying that he knew Andrew Carnegie until Andrew Carnegie passed away. So I'm going to share my screen again and go to the Novak article, which is The Untold Story of Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time. And we'll scroll down to the section here. And so here Novak says Hill's most infamous claim was that he met and interviewed at length the industrialist Andrew Carnegie in 1908, the richest man in the world at the time. Hill said that Carnegie tasked him with interviewing the most successful men in business and learning the secrets to their success, but Hill only started making this claim long after Carnegie had died in 1919. Hill spent the 1920s telling of his great mission from Carnegie and went on to write an entire book detailing his conversations with Carnegie. It was first published as Think Your Way to Wealth in 1948, then in 1953 as How to Raise Your Own Salary. How to Raise Your Own Salary in 1953 and Think Your Way to Wealth in 1948 are the exact same content, just different titles. And today, published by the Napoleon Hill Foundation under the name Napoleon Hill's The Wisdom of Andrew Carnegie as Told to Napoleon Hill. So this was released in, I believe, 2005 under the Napoleon Hill Foundation publishing company. And it is called Napoleon Hill's The Wisdom of Andrew Carnegie as Told to Napoleon Hill. So Novak comments, frankly, the entire book is laughable. What's ostensibly a conversation between Hill and Carnegie is written in the garbled style of self-help get-rich nonsense that Hill would help popularize. And tellingly, in the official biography released in 1995, this is written in 1995, it's called The Lifetime of Riches, its official biography released by the Napoleon Hill Foundation. Hill's biographers can't help but concede that the book released about this meeting was largely fiction, or as they put it, a somewhat contrived conversational format featuring Hill and Andrew Carnegie. They insist that the meeting really did happen, just that Hill expanded it into a work that contained his own ideas about success. But the 300-page ramblings are so absurd as to be transparently a work concocted from whole cloth by Hill. And then Novak goes on to reveal that he contacted Andrew Carnegie biographer David Nassau about the alleged meeting with Carnegie and Hill, and he told me he found no evidence of any sort that Carnegie and Hill ever met. I pressed Nassau about whether there was any chance at all that Hill's book could be based on real events. Nassau replied, "Let me put it in this way. I found no evidence that the book was authentic." And so this seems very valid. I mean, Andrew Carnegie biographer David Nassau actually says he found no evidence that he knew Napoleon Hill or ever met Napoleon Hill. But let me just point this out to you, is that David Nassau is alive today. He was not alive during Andrew Carnegie's time. He did the same thing all of us have access to, which is research to materials that exist throughout history about the life of Andrew Carnegie. And in what he had access to about the life of Andrew Carnegie, there was no evidence that he knew Napoleon Hill. But here in a minute, I'm going to present to you the evidence that I found that he did. Because one of the things that happens with the human mind is if we automatically believe something and we go into that belief or that finding out the evidence of that with that belief, then we go into it biased. And then what we begin to do is not just look for evidence that that thing is true. We don't do that in looking for the alternative. We go into it looking for what we believe is true. So I believe what David Nassau and Matt Novak and other critics do when they do their own research is they say Napoleon Hill's a fraud. That is tattooed on their brain. And then the evidence they find corroborates that. Instead of saying, hey, it's equally a 50-50 possibility that he knew Andrew Carnegie and didn't know Andrew Carnegie, and then go into it unbiasedly because they would have came across the evidence that I'm going to present to you. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen on the Novak article and share my screen again, and just show you the email that I received from David Nassau, because I emailed him as well, and this was his reply. So let me just share my screen and show you that before we go into what I found out about Napoleon Hill's relationship with Andrew Carnegie. So this is an email to David Nassau. Well, I asked him the same thing. Um, so, hello, Mr. Nassau. I'm hoping you are willing to answer a question about Andrew Carnegie that I cannot verify with independent research. Let me just zoom in here real quick. Are you willing to reply and let me know if there is any evidence in your research of Andrew Carnegie of him being interviewed by Bob Taylor's magazine in 1908 or meeting with Napoleon Hill, author of the book Think and Grow Rich? This was his reply. Very blunt and to the point. You cannot verify that Napoleon Hill met with Andrew Carnegie because there is no evidence of any sort that he did. I have been presented with the question you asked dozens and dozens of times, so often, in fact, that I shudder with disbelief whenever I am asked again. In my years' research in Andrew Carnegie's life, I never came across any mention of Napoleon Hill. I can only conclude that Mr. Hill made it all up. So that is very clear. So it seems like he's disgusted with even the thought that Napoleon Hill made up his relationship with Andrew Carnegie. But let me show you my findings, and then you can draw your own conclusions for yourself. So yet again, I'm going to share my screen. This is from the Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer. And we'll go to page 103. And so this is what I want to present to you. This is an article, and I'm going to minimize my screen so you can see it. A newspaper article written by Napoleon Hill. So this is the Taylor Trotwood magazine. Okay. It was released in 1907, the magazine. And prior to that, it was called Bob Taylor's magazine that was released in 1905. This is the November 1908 issue. So I wanted to show you the title. And I'm going to blow it up so that you can see who the editor of the magazine is. So this is the successor to Bob Taylor's magazine and Trotwood's monthly. Robert Taylor and John Trotwood merged their two publications together in 1907 and called Bob Taylor's magazine the Taylor Trotwood Magazine. So you can see here that Senator Bob Taylor and John Trotwood Moore are editors. Also, if you look at the contents, okay, you'll see down here that the article called Mobile, Alabama is written by Oliver Napoleon Hill. He was known as his birth name, which is Oliver at this time, because this was in 1908, before he moved to Washington, D.C., and began to be known as just Napoleon Hill. And he did that for a couple of reasons. Critics would have you believe that he changed his name because he was running away from a scandal involving the lumber company that he was the sales manager for and also co-owner of, eventually co-owner of, and wanted to change his name. But my name is Jason Allen Youngblood. If I was really trying to hide from somebody, what sense does it make for me to just be known as Allen Youngblood? Ooh, really inconspicuous for somebody to know what my name is and for me to just use my middle name and my last name. So first, just thinking through that rationally, that doesn't make any sense that he was trying to hide from people by using his middle name because people knew him as O.N. Hill. So they knew his first, middle, and last name in Alabama because prior to becoming known as Napoleon Hill in 1908, he was known as O.N. or the initials O.N. Hill, Oliver Napoleon. So they knew his whole name. So it wasn't a very good attempt to hide from people that were looking to sue him for a scandal about his dealings in lumber. Additionally, he had recently gone through a very nasty divorce from a woman named Edith Whitman. We'll learn more about her later because Novak does talk about her. And he was trying to avoid her. He moved from Alabama, where she lived with him at one time, to get away from his connection with her as well too. So after his businesses failed, and it was at the same year that Edith Whitman divorced him, and actually it was a very nasty divorce. There was infidelity involved and everything. He wanted to reinvent himself and he wanted to start writing for Bob Taylor. And so, because he wanted to actually stand out as a writer for Bob Taylor's magazine, he began to become known as Napoleon Hill, but only for the main reason of having a catchy author name for his writings. But he wasn't hiding or negating from being sued or being caught and imprisoned for a scandal in Mobile, Alabama about lumber, which we'll talk about on another episode. And so down here, you'll see, well, I have access to the full article. So if you would like the copy of this newspaper article, the entire article in Mobile, Alabama, that Napoleon Hill wrote, you can message me at the Gospel of Napoleon Hill Scholar or Scammer Facebook page. So that's on Facebook. And then I'll just read the contents here. So the Taylor Trotwood Magazine, successor to Bob Taylor's magazine and Trotwood's Monthly, published monthly by Taylor Trotwood Publishing Company, Vanderbilt Law Building, Nashville, Tennessee. Senator Bob Taylor and John Trotwood Moore, editors. Price $1.50 a year or 15 cents a copy in the U.S., Mexico, and Cuba. $2 a year in Canada, $2.25 a year in other foreign countries. And then Mobile, Alabama is on page 181 of that article. I have access to that article. Now, the next article I want to show you is not only is there evidence that he knew Robert Taylor, so here's the connection. So my findings is that you're right. Okay, there's no direct connection between Napoleon Hill and Andrew Carnegie other than just the story that he told. But there is an indirect connection, not a direct connection, and not pure evidence. So he knew Robert Taylor. He wrote for Robert Taylor. Okay. And his rendition of the story is that it is through Robert Taylor that he met Andrew Carnegie. When he began to write for Bob Taylor's magazine, or Taylor Trotwood magazine in 1907, Bob Taylor approached him and said, I want you to write success stories about the most successful people in America today. And I'm going to introduce you to people to interview them so that you can write about how they became successful. According to Napoleon Hill, this is how he met Andrew Carnegie. Bob Taylor introduced him to Andrew Carnegie. So let's find out the actual validity of that argument from Hill or that claim from Hill. And so here is an article showing that Robert Taylor was close personal friends with Andrew Carnegie and knew him very well. So let me just zoom in here and stop sharing for a second and share again. Bear with me. Nope, starting to mess up here. My computer is freezing. Just bear with me 1 second. I'm going to close out the article and reopen it. Sorry for the long pause. Just reopening the article and getting to the page where that article was. So I was just saying that the newspaper article or the magazine article, Mobile, Alabama, that was written in November 1908 or published in John Trotwood's and Robert Taylor's magazine in 1908, the Taylor Trotwood magazine, you'll see that there is evidence that he knew Robert Taylor. Now, if we go to Robert Taylor's relationship with Andrew Carnegie, we'll see that that is significant as well too, and that Hill's story actually checks out. Okay, here we go. So, okay, here we go. So I'm going to share my screen. Apologies for the long pause there in the video. So this is the article that I referenced. It was released in the Champaign Daily, Champaign, Illinois, March 30th, 1909. All right, the caption just says Hill's employer Robert Taylor speaks at the Optimist Club's first annual banquet on March 31st, 1909. Andrew Carnegie is the president of the club. So the president of the Optimist Club is Andrew Carnegie. Theodore Roosevelt, okay, and newly elected president William Howard Taft are members of this club. Okay. The club had 700,000 members who pledged to keep optimistic thoughts and ideas. So here is the idea of having a positive mental attitude, having a positive mindset. Andrew Carnegie was the president of a club with 700,000 members that included two former presidents, as well as other notable people and everyday Americans whose whole purpose was to promote having optimistic, positive thoughts and ideas. So this is where Napoleon Hill got the idea from as far as being positive and your thoughts actually being the cause of what you attract as an experience into your life. Andrew Carnegie was a proponent of that, and here is evidence of him being the president and the founder of the Optimist Club. So let's see who was the keynote speaker at this banquet here. And so we'll just read the article. The Optimist Day. This year, a sensible step is to be taken to get into the shade of the foolish practice of observing April 1st on a day of practical jokes at the expense of others. The movement has been started in New York by the formation of a club known as the Optimist Club, whose motto is Smile. President Taft is an honorary member of the club's executive committee. Andrew Carnegie is the honorary president. Theodore Roosevelt is a member, as are Joseph H. Coate, Nicholas Murray Butler, Henry Clews, and many others of that class. The club is to have its first annual banquet in the evening of March 31st with speeches by several distinguished men, including Robert Love Taylor of Tennessee, the senator from Tennessee, Robert Love Taylor or Bob Taylor. Okay. So there you see that Robert Taylor gave the keynote speech at the first annual banquet of the Optimist Club. And so that is how we know that he knew Andrew Carnegie. There's another article that I will show you in episode 5 of Bob Taylor giving a eulogy for Andrew Carnegie. And a eulogy doesn't just happen when somebody passes away at a funeral. It just means to speak well of. And so he releases an article and nationally syndicates it in newspapers across the country, praising Andrew Carnegie and speaking about his relationship with him personally. And so I just wanted to touch on the next point of the article from Novak, The Untold Story of Napoleon Hill, the greatest self-help scammer of all time, is that there's no evidence whatsoever that he knew Woodrow Wilson, uh, President, not Theodore Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and Andrew Carnegie, and show you the connection. His connection with Andrew Carnegie, there's not a direct connection. So I do acknowledge that. So there's no direct evidence. However, to say that there's no evidence whatsoever, he knew somebody and worked for somebody and was employed by somebody who was actually friends with Andrew Carnegie and worked with Andrew Carnegie. Okay. And then he also was friends with somebody who was in the Wilson administration, as well as the Roosevelt administration, in Daniel C. Roper. Daniel C. Roper was the commissioner for the Internal Revenue Service for the Wilson administration. And then in 1931, we see him promoting Napoleon Hill School International Success University. William C. Grace was in the Franklin Roosevelt administration, on the board of the National Recovery Administration. He's also the director of Napoleon Hill School International Success University. So, if you would like a free PDF of my book, The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar for Scammer, or a link to purchase it at a discounted price, please let me know. I'm not going to ask you to subscribe or follow or share. You know where to find me. This is The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer YouTube channel to be able to see the next video for more information. We also have a Facebook page, The Gospel of Napoleon Hill, Scholar or Scammer Facebook page as well. You can message me there. But until the next episode, like Dr. Dre and Snoop Dogg, talk to you then.